Assalamu alaikum, greetings and welcome. Thank you all for joining us today at the Halal Travel Global Summit hosted by Crescent Rating and for attending this particular session on leadership in times of crisis. My name is Rashid Toefy and I'm the Deputy Director General for Economic Development and Tourism in Cape Town, South Africa. And I'll be moderating this panel today with a group of industry leaders focusing on how context impacts on leaders and how they make decisions in crisis situations. Never before has an entire generation of government and business leaders been so connected by a common, simultaneous existential threat. Barriers between cities and companies have quickly dissolved during COVID in an effort to sustain infrastructure, to save jobs, to save lives, and to reimagine the future. But crises have always served as a catalyst for social and economic change, and they're critical inflection points in our history. Previous crises, even as far back as the Great Depression or our financial crisis, have provided learning opportunities to galvanize society and to bring positive change. And this is no different. But while a lot has been written on the subject academically and in the mainstream, I'm excited today here to be joined by three leaders in the travel industry who have led businesses, they've consulted to government and the private sector during this tumultuous period. And so I welcome today my three panelists. But instead of me introducing each of them, I would like to ask each of you today, who I know very well, Anita, Sumaira, and Nisha, to please introduce yourselves and perhaps take a minute and just tell the audience who you are. No personal secrets around how well you know me, but it's been fantastic to work with you over the years to kind of go through this difficult period. And so let's start with Anita. Anita, I think you may know her. She's a globally recognized strategist and advisor and a personality. So Anita, over to you first. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And a very warm assalamu alaikum. I'm delighted to be with you all. My name is Anita Mendiratta. I'm part of the Rashid Toefy fan club. And I am internationally a global executive advisor, author, and diplomat, as well as on-air personality when it comes to the areas of tourism, aviation, and development. So the ecosystem that works around that. I'm honored to lead my London-based consulting firm, having worked with over 100 countries in the last 20 years, very much working with leaders in government, in business, and in global organizations to make sure that the travel and tourism industry is really working to build countries and to build communities and also to protect the environment. I'm honored to be the special advisor to the Secretary General of the United Nations World Tourism Organization. I also work closely with CNN International and very much grateful to be an executive in residence at the University of Surrey and a visiting professor at Cranfield Aeronautical University. I have board positions from South Africa to Saudi Arabia, and most importantly, I'm very grateful and excited to be with you all today. So thank you, Rashid, for that opportunity.
Thank you, Anita. And, for someone who's all over the world, I get the pleasure of seeing Anita every now and then when her board positions bring her to my hometown, Cape Town. So next, I'd like to introduce Sumaira, who I have the privilege of actually working very closely, working in the same company with. So Sumaira, thank you for joining us. And please tell us a little bit about yourself. You're still on mute, Sumaira. Thank you.
There we go. Thank you, Rashid. Like Anita, I'm part of that fan club, but also I'd like to say that I was your boss in the previous life. And yes, I've had such privilege to engage with you, work with you in the past life. So just to introduce myself here for the audience, I'm Sumaira Isaacs. And I've been a veteran of the industry, specifically focused on the MICE, the meetings, incentives, and conference and event side of things for the last 25 years. It gives away my age under my colored hair here. I am currently right now working with the Gulf Tunes, which is a Fairfax Canada-owned company. It's a legacy brand of DMCs. For the past 30 years, they've operated in the region of Middle East, which is UAE, Oman, Qatar, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia. I've just recently actually joined them, Rashid, because some of you know me also from my previous stint at World Tourism Forum Institute as CEO, where I was there with them for 3.5 years. I'm still part of the executive board there. I still advise and move the organization wherever it needs to go. But I think one of the things which I learned by being part of the World Tourism Forum Institute, and I'll talk about it later because it was during that very critical COVID period, that how do you improvise and how do you reinvent yourself as an organization. But previous to that, I've worked with Emirates Group for 10 years and MCI Group, one of the largest PCOs around the world. One of the trivias that some of the people don't know about me is that I'm an artist. So I have a tendency to approach everything in a very creative mind zone, because I feel that there's always a solution. That I'm coming from a very positive aspect, that you can approach a problem and find a solution if you apply yourself to it creatively. So yeah, that's me, and I'm here in Dubai talking to you with these lovely ladies, my friends. So happy to be part of this group.
Thank you, boss. No, thank you very much. And I know the feeling of being led by both an expert but also an artist, and it was a pleasure to work with you. So, and lastly, I'm very proud to say Dr. Nisha Abubakar, who's recently got her PhD. Nisha, thank you for joining us. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you, and it's such a pleasure being with the three of you here and reconnecting. I'm from the sunny island of Singapore. And I would say that I'm a tourism and hospitality consultant working with destinations as well as tourism and hospitality organizations with respect to tourism development, branding, human capacity building. And I'm also a very strong advocate of women's empowerment and development. And there's World Women Tourism, was conceived in the smack of COVID. And also a academic with some of the Australian universities, and also a corporate trainer with many of the tourism boards. So that's me and my background, and really excited to have a conversation with all of you today.
Thank you, Nisha. And I'm a little bit jealous that you're right there with this audience. And so if you have any more further questions, you can catch Nisha on site in Singapore. And next time we'll try to be there. So I'm going to kick off with a couple of slides just to shape our discussion. And then I'll return to ask some questions of each of you and respond to this topic of leadership in a crisis. So I chose this as a starting picture, the beautiful Cape Town Lion's Head, because it's where I last saw all of us together when we met advising this region on how to build a tourism master plan for this area. And it really is, it's a place that has seen lots of change, historical change. It's a meeting place of East and West, and it's where I reside right now. I wanted to, this incredible quote by Arundhati Roy, for me, poetically captures what the recent crisis was, and I'm going to read it out. Coronavirus has made the mighty kneel and brought the world to a halt like nothing else could. Our minds are still racing back and forth, longing for a return to normality, trying to stitch our futures to the past and refusing to acknowledge the rupture. But nothing could be worse than a return to normality. Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew, and this one is no different. It's a portal, a gateway between the one world and the next. So we can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through it lightly and with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. So what I love about that is it speaks about a world where we have a choice to emerge from this portal and return with a different perspective on everything, on the environment, and particularly in my area of interest here today is how is that impacted on how we lead organizations resiliently. So we live in a world which people are now calling a series of simultaneous crises, what's being known as a polycrisis. And everything from the financial crisis to fires in Australia and in California to our recent drought in the Western Cape. And it's not the only area where we've had shortages of resources like water. And of course, COVID that really brought the world to a halt and brought our travel industry to an unprecedented stop. I think what's important for me, what emerges from that, is that these crises have drawn attention to the issue of leadership, because in the context of a crisis, it exposes many individual and systemic weaknesses in people's leadership capabilities. And that's what I'd like to focus on today, is to say, what are some of the competencies that we need to be looking at as we navigate this world, which sadly to say will be about dealing with crises, future ones and the current ones. So there's been a lot of disruption. There's been companies that have either failed or frozen, but the ones who have innovated are the ones who have been resilient. And that resilience comes from the resilience of individual leaders. So much has been written, everything from academic institution like Harvard, who's done a thorough study of crises over generations, to books that have been written, classic old books like Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, where we talk about how people what is the behavioral change happening, and to books like Nassim's book on the black swans. But all that's really done is had us understand crises a little bit better almost after the fact. What I'd like to do is look a little bit at how do we anticipate the behaviors that we might need to manage crises better. So this little diagram just indicates an intersection of three areas that I'm currently doing some research on for my PhD. And it's where the study of crisis and leadership under crisis conditions intersects with decision making, and particularly how leaders make decisions based on their context. And then lastly, what are the leadership behaviors that influence that, whether it's sense making in a crisis, intuition, people using improvisation in difficult situations. So that's the nexus that I'd like to have a conversation with about today. But importantly, for the context of this conference, we are talking about the halal travel market. For me, the Muslim travel market, and it's been a burgeoning industry. We all know it presents a massive global opportunity, but just like all other travel sectors have been disrupted by COVID and by crises, this particular segment of the travel market has had certain disruptors. And this is not only unique to the Muslim travel market or the halal sector, it goes across all sectors. And that's the fact that people are going to be post-COVID much more tech-enabled. It's fast-tracked that. Travelers and young people are more responsible. They want meaningful experiences, and there's a real emphasis on sustainability. These are just some of the trends which have been emerging in the travel industry in general. And I just wanted to add this last slide to say, as with all travel sectors, we can't see them as one single contiguous group. They actually are pretty diverse, and particularly there's an emphasis on young women travelers who travel on their own, and the various segments of society, the millennials, the Gen Zs, who will give us different kinds of challenges as we navigate this post-COVID period. So with that as a context, I'd now like to switch towards a conversation with each of my panelists and engage a little bit from your own personal experiences. So, according to a Harvard Business Review article, this writer Kuhn speaks about leaders not simply being born, but being forged in a crisis. And I wanted to look to each of you in the areas that you've worked, both geographically and the areas of focus of your lives, how do you think different contexts have impact on leaders and how they make decisions during this crisis situation? So I'm going to go to each of you to just reflect on that. Anita, could I start with you? Because you've had you work in so many interesting geographies, and please tell us a little bit about your perspective on this.
I can indeed. Thank you very much. And Rashid, thank you for the presentation, because I think importantly, what stood out from it, and particularly your bravery in taking on a PhD, which I think is really wonderful, is that you're looking at it exactly as you said, from the point of view of what can we understand going into a crisis, rather than spending the time coming out of it. And that's really important, because the nature of crisis is shock, is surprise, is responding to what we had no idea was coming, or even if we had little whispers of indication, we couldn't conceptualize what was going to happen. So your doing this and your sharing your presentation was very important for everyone to be able to embrace the fact that we need not be victims to that shock. We need not be victims to that surprise. So that to me is very important. What's also critical is that you have framed something which is fundamentally at the heart of the challenge of crisis. Crisis is not linear, it's layered. It happens multiple at the time. As you said, South Africa had gone through the water crisis. They were going through COVID. Now they're going through an energy crisis. They were already going through security crisis, financial stability crisis. So it's not as if one crisis stopped so another one could start. This is very important. So to your point about context, it is fundamentally important, both in terms of leading through crisis, how one responds to the crisis, and then frames that within the general context of calm and other challenges that might exist. I give an example from the point of view of one of my favorite leaders in the world, which is a gentleman named Brad Dean, who is the CEO of Discover Puerto Rico. Now, Puerto Rico is this beautiful, beautiful island state in the Caribbean that Mother Nature, for some reason, keeps picking on. And the number of extreme crises that it goes through in terms of weather year after year after year with hurricanes is incredible. Plus, going into COVID, they were just recovering from the challenge of Zika. So between the hurricanes and Zika, the reputation of Puerto Rico as a destination was already hurting. Brad is an amazing leader because he has the ability to tap into the humanity of the people he is leading, not just into the brain power, but really recognizing the fact that the context is one in which they can all rise above rather than fall victim to. Because the fact remains that, looking at the stats, 91 million people in that island state work in tourism. So if they resign to the fact that, well, we're just going to be victims to all these crises, you've lost the entire industry. Plus, the world has lost an incredible destination. So context is vital to how a leader is able to rally up the confidence, the courage, the spirit, and the vision of the people that they are working with, whether they're working in the Caribbean, the Middle East, on the mainland of the US, whatever the case may be. I hope that answers your first question with a tick.
It absolutely does. And I think I commend your bravery, because I know Anita's recently authored a book. I hope I'm allowed to say it. Hopefully we'll see it soon and we'll hear more from you about how leaders have led in the crisis. So thank you for your perspective and for bringing that kind of South America interesting perspective. And I want to shift over now to Nisha, Dr. Abubakar. I'm just going to call you Nisha, okay? And Nisha, you've worked in you work in Singapore, but also in Bhutan and in other parts of the world. You know, from your perspective, how has this context influenced leaders?
Right. Rashid, I remember I was in a complete flux, in terms as an individual, I was stranded at the airport. As a business owner, totally, caught off guard. And as a tourism industry, I think it was so badly impacted. So, we didn't have any predetermined response to what was going on. And fortunately, I took most of my responses, a very action-oriented response immediately to what was going on from our government. Pretty lucky to have a government here in Singapore that it had a lot of clarity. The way the government dealt with the crisis was a very strong, coordinated approach. And it was pretty systematic. So when we were so lost, we took the cue from the government, So with respect to how the industry should look at the crisis, what we could do in terms of funding, in terms of our capacity building exercise that we had to go through, I think the context of where I come from, Singapore, was instrumental. It helped to make sense, of the crisis when information was incomplete. Or also the other side, there was an info glut. There's too much of information too. We couldn't make sense of what was going on. So we needed a larger body like the government here in Singapore to help us make sense of what was going on. So there was a lot of guidance, what our industry could do. And one of it is, for example, is how we approach safety. Life got to move on, but how we're going to do that was important. So safety was given a priority, and we looked into how the industry could look at starting its operations, going back to events, for example, but putting safety at the center of it all. We wanted to be a leading destination. Even then, I think the government and Singapore Tourism Board had the vision that, we've got to build a country that is grounded on safety. In the perception of travelers, even in the future, they should see Singapore as a highly safe destination, So we developed calls. I was asked to develop curriculum for the MICE industry, and that led to not just training, but it led to also consultancy work from a business that had really nothing, when the COVID started, to put safety. And fortunately, we had funding, finance from the government to support that. It was easy to move on looking at safety. And the positive thing is that because we did that, we were one of the first to come out of the crisis with respect to the MICE industry. And today we are one of the leading destinations with respect to MICE as well, So certainly the context played a very important role in how I approached the crisis and what sort of business developed as a result of that. And how even now, we still take the cue from the government, with respect to sustainability as a primary focus now in the road to recovery of this industry. So maybe I'll expand on this a little more after Sumaira.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd love to, and I'd love to expand specifically with each of you on those leadership capabilities. We're through the crisis, as you've said, Anita. But now, what have we learned as leaders, and how do we make better decisions going forward from the crisis? So the emphasis I'd like to in this conversation is to bring that out, the actual, what did leaders do? And is there something about your environment which we can learn from? Because I think leaders have made, I know in South Africa, where we a little bit, I would almost say, used to crises. We've had several crises. I think we dealt with it better. And when I've interviewed people in Canada or in another country, it came as a big shock, and people dealt with it differently because the uncertainty isn't something you live with every day. So Sumaira, you've worked and lived in Canada particularly, and in Dubai and globally in many places. But how have you seen different contexts impact on leadership, particularly during this crisis time?
So Anita and Nisha has given me a good segue. During that time, that particular, so if you're talking about context, I was really based out of Canada, and I have just joined Embark. So I will touch upon leadership in context of World Tourism Forum Institute. So I joined on 1st of January 2020, an organization, and with great plans, with conferences happening all around the world, and then COVID struck in February. And I sitting in Canada, I was managing this global organization with staff who was spread over 6 to 7 countries. So I think, had to deep down intuitively into my leadership skills, really, and also into the environment. And the environment was very North American at that time. And although, North America in general had caught up, but the industry was still taking time to come to terms with what was happening in a part of world which hadn't yet touched them, but they needed to be prepped for it, So it was a very funny, strange time. So from the organizational perspective, for me, what was important to weigh in at that point was that how do we transform ourselves? How do we take ourselves forward? Is there a need to transform, or can we continue to doing what we did traditionally? So fast forward, and this was February, then March was also weighing in, what, just trying to make sense of what was happening. But in May, when we started seeing our conferences getting canceled all around us, so do we lay off people? So I very quickly made a decision there on just at that spot that no, we will try to transform ourselves. So from a very conference-based organization, we transformed using the same resources, the same people, into a think tank. So we had the creative team, we had the research team, we had some business development and project management, and we said, okay, we change all of that, and I regrouped the board, put in some academics on the board itself, brought those people in, and we said, okay, we transform ourselves as an organization. But one of the most, I think, fundamental things that I did at that point was, and it was all intuitive, there was no guidance as such. You couldn't really look to anybody because the tourism boards in Canada was struggling. I was very far from UAE, my traditional base, and there was not like a cookie cutter model that everybody could follow, so I realized that we need to stick together as an industry at that point, and a platform like World Tourism Forum Institute can help doing that. So I started reaching out to colleagues, and we created something like World Tourism Forum Institute town halls for COVID crisis management. And I started reaching out to industry colleagues who would want to come and speak on these town halls. And we ended up doing something like 120 town halls. And that was my way of bringing the industry together so that we could connect, although we were all holed up in our apartments, in our homes, in our townhouses. I felt that this really can help us to connect, to share, to learn from one another, to lean on one another, and so that you're not facing this crisis alone. And on the organizational front, so that was on the front end. On the back end, that whole transformation was going on, and little did I realize that, okay, going that route of being a think tank was so much needed at that time, because there was research need. People needed that kind of information. And also we kind of went hybrid, right, by doing those town halls, but not knowing that hybrid is going to be that fashionable or virtual term that will come to stay with us for some time. We at that point thought forever, because by creating those town halls, I was going into that whole hybrid model, which led into 2 or 3 or 4 virtual meetings. But so I think it was an instinctive leadership which was which really served me at that point.
Thank you, Sumaira. I mean, I'd venture to say that you brought a perspective from your own context of having lived and worked in Pakistan, having lived in the Middle East. I think you brought some of that. What I'm really finding in my research is that you bring your prior experience from your context to a situation. So perhaps you dealt with it also because you're an events person. So for you, you brought that prior experience to your leadership decision making, to a Canadian environment.
Absolutely, you're right. You are right.
Yeah. And so, Anita, I want to go back to you. I mean, in the different markets you've worked in, have you seen any specific contextual characteristics that you think impacted on leaders, whether it was nation-specific factors or factors to do with the whether you're working in a democracy or a kingdom? How have you seen that influence leadership? Because I want us to learn here today, in whichever market you live, how can we learn from those other contextual factors?
And it's a lovely question, and thank you for that. And it's lovely hearing Sumaira and Nisha's points of view, because they really, both of them, embody the fact that COVID particularly, we have never as a global community experienced one single crisis that hit everyone, everywhere, was merciless, was mutating, but most importantly, was invisible. So we didn't know where it was. We had no idea. And it was a virus that taught us to stay apart and not trust. I raise that because, in going back to Sumaira's example and your question about context, what is critical about leadership is always keeping in mind that this is about leaders and they're human and they're doing the best they can with no information, and recognizing that everyone is a victim of circumstance. Businesses closed out of no fault of their own. Businesses closed with leaders not being able to simply serve markets, like Nisha was saying. Lives were lost for no fault of their own. They were just victims. So the point is, what is critical when it comes to context is the operating environment of a leader itself. So when one looks at a nation state like Singapore, when you look at a kingdom, when you look at the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, for instance, those were some of the strongest examples of leading through this crisis, because no one had to question the judgment of leaders. There was trust, there was confidence, and as Nisha said, people looked to government because they relied on them. In environments that were, for lack of better words, more democratic, and when sadly the virus became politicized, that's when leadership became very difficult, because leaders had to look over their shoulder as to who was behind them. So the pillars for me of competent leadership is credibility of the individual, the competence of the individual, the character of the individual, but vitally, the communication of the individual. In a crisis, people are scared. We are all the same. We simply want to know, are we safe? And what are we working towards? When you're dealing with much more, whether it's benevolent dictatorships, those environments are environments where people have an innate trust and a belief in the judgment of the leaders. They don't have to worry about it. Where leadership failed was where leadership became politicized, and it was a win-lose rather than a win-win-win-win-win. And that's what became very interesting. We saw it with Paul Griffiths, the CEO of Dubai Airports, and how he was entrusted by the royal family to just get on and make it happen, make it work, recognizing that the heartbeat of the economy and society of Dubai and the UAE was the airport. He was trusted to re-engineer the airport, protect jobs, but transform the airport into something better when it comes out on the other side. That means they believed there was another side. And what's amazing is Paul spoke about the fact that Dubai Airport is one of the largest airports in the world, 100 million passengers per year. They used to have, in May of 2020, the same number of travelers going through Dubai Airport in a month that used to go through the airport in one single hour. But he wasn't frozen on that. He knew he had the trust of his leadership to lead the airport and the economic and social ecosystem to something better. So context is critical because it links directly to confidence in leadership and the confidence of those that are following.
All right. May I just add something to what Anita is saying, because it's brilliant point that she has raised, in terms of trust. I think one of the things that even research showed, and the reason why, again, Singapore was pretty successful in managing the crisis to some extent, is how the leaders build social capital in this country, or even countries that did far better, in terms of managing the crisis, were countries that had built social capital even before the crisis happened, not when the crisis happened. Then you think about building social capital. And I think it's a very important message to countries as well as to corporate organizations as well. How do you build that social capital so strong that there is trust, reciprocity, there is collaboration, so much that, when you've got to make decisions, the people or your employees follow that, or they trust that you're making the best decision for them. And secondly, one of the important things that I've learned in this crisis is how leaders of the state or even organization, they were not just focusing on crisis management at the economic level, but they were also looking at how do you get emotional and mental preparedness happening so that the economic recovery can happen. So we focus a lot on that, on ensuring that people were mentally and emotionally prepared. Even up to now, you will notice that it's so difficult to get people to come back to work. So difficult, and a lot got to do with their mental and emotional state, as well as, other structural issues. So how do you focus on the mental and emotional well-being of people today so that you get to become a preferred employer, for example? So it's still happening at the moment. And even here, lots of efforts, initiatives at the state level, as well as at the organizational level, is going towards mental and emotional well-being of the people here. And I think that's so important today as leaders, that we need to focus on that. So if you take it from the tourism perspective, it's going to be the same. Our industry, we can't get enough people coming back to work in our industry. It's every country in the world, we are all struggling, to staff. We bring them back. Okay, we were notorious. We were not known for taking care of the emotional and mental well-being of our staff in our industry, but now we've got to, right?
Yeah. Nisha, I wanted to ask you, because Anita has, I can see a sort of 4 C's model coming out, the Anita 4x4 matrix on credibility, character, I think, communications. But Nisha, you work with women in tourism, and I wanted to know, from a gender perspective, gender and some of the research you did on spirituality, from those 2 contextual aspects of leadership in a crisis. Not specifically your Singapore success story. I'm looking at what do you think gender brought to people when they were bringing the issue that somebody is a woman leader as opposed to a male leader in a crisis situation. Just briefly, and then we've got about 7 minutes left, so I've got to go to Sumaira on another question.
Right. So it's interesting because, from the podcast, the Women We Watch in Tourism podcast, as well as some of the global webinars that we've been doing, we've been speaking to women. And one of the interesting things is that regardless of whichever country the women come from, including we have Sumaira and Anita, we often speak about empathetic leadership, and a spirituality in leadership where, it's driven by a higher purpose, and empathy and love becomes important because this is a human tragedy, the whole COVID, right? And what is required is a human dimension to leading. So very often, whether they are leaders of hospitality or tourism organization, what I hear them speaking is about empathy, compassion, the way they lead people, even funding that they are looking at is towards causes which has got a higher purpose. Right? So I wouldn't say this is just purely a women, but it's a trait which is feminine trait, I would say. Yeah.
Thank you. Sumaira, I want to ask you that one of the things again that I see that in crisis situations, people have improvised. People can't just go ahead, and you spoke a little bit about intuition and improvisation. Do you have some examples in your mind in markets you've worked where this has been an important decision-making aspect, improvisation?
And I think our whole industry, our events industry, is based on that's the crux of that industry, is to foresee, to improvise, to predict, and so forth. So I think that came to me naturally during the crisis, because that's what we do. You're right. That's the business we are in. We are constantly doing crisis management in other aspects. If it's not COVID, it could be at an event, or somebody trips over a carpet. That's a crisis management as well. So for me, that came naturally, and the industry is geared for that. I think that's what we do. That's what we are best at as well. But I want to say this thing a little bit, that it is the reaction, the post COVID reaction of how the industry is coming out of it, and how the leaders are reacting now. It is different from country to country. It really is different from region to region. And I just now spent 2 weeks in North America. I visited in 10 days, 7, 8 cities there. And did I hear about COVID? Not a lot, guys. People are coming out of it. And did I see anybody masking up on the flights, on the planes? Not really. And yet there is a second spread, or third or fourth spread, which is going there. It's in the news, and the coverage is there. I think people have become, and so have the leaderships, have become more resilient, and they don't want to acknowledge such deep crisis anymore. People want to move on. Here where I am in Dubai, this region, Anita, you've been here recently. Nisha, you were here last year as well. It's on steroids right now. What COVID? What crisis? And what mental health. It's it's really it's about entrepreneurship again. It's about moving on, creating new jobs, new economy, and more investments into infrastructure. All around me, we are in a construction zone right now, so it's build more.
I have to ask you just to wrap, because we've got just 3 minutes left, 2 minutes, and I just want to ask you each just in 30 seconds. Tell me, from what we've said today, are we ready for the burgeoning Muslim traveler in different perspectives? What's each of your views? Perhaps we can start with Nisha, just very briefly. I'm going to give you 30 seconds for your perspective of if we're ready for the Muslim traveler of the future, having learned from this crisis.
Yeah, I think we are very ready for the Muslim traveler. We've got enough data, intelligence, thanks to Crescent Rating. When you go into your website, there's so much of information available if countries are serious about tapping the potential of this particular market. But I just want to say that I've looked at many countries. I've worked with Crescent Rating a fair bit. But if countries are highly coordinated in this approach, serious about tapping this market, and innovative, right? There's huge potential. I was having a conversation with one of the regional directors of SDB, and he says, we tried a lot of work, and the returns hasn't been that very much. And I was saying to him, maybe it's the right thing, but at the wrong time. But now is the right thing at the right time, and we do it with optimism and innovative strategies. I think we can really do very well in tapping the potential of this billion-dollar market.
Thank you, Nisha. Thank you. And Anita, 30 seconds from you. Where do you think we're at? Or even,
30 seconds. Bottom line is this: Mother Nature gave us this opportunity to re-engineer our industry. Ready or not, the Muslim halal traveler, whatever you want to call that segment, is happening. If we look at one of the most beautiful leaders, Fahad Hamid-Adin, who's the CEO of Saudi Tourism, and the growth of Saudi tourism, it's because they are honoring the fact that this traveling community is anxious and excited to travel. Importantly, travel is a part of the healing from crisis. We've seen that from the mental health crisis. So we have to recognize that these are human beings. We can't define them by Muslim. We can't define them by halal and what they eat. These are human beings like us who want to travel. So ready or not, the opportunity is there to leverage. We must embrace it, as we must embrace every single traveler that enters.
Thank you. I want to thank you all. I wish we had more time. It's been invigorating, and I hope the audience has enjoyed it. Thank you very much for joining this panel discussion, and enjoy the rest of the conference, everybody. Take care, and I'll see you around. Everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Assalamu alaikum and bye-bye.
Alaikum salam.